All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the ICLR Friday Forum for February 23rd, 2024. This is one of a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Porter, ICLR's Chief Engineer. Last time on February 9th, we brought you Professor Matthew Boudreau. Matthew spoke about his model of flood losses and the costing and funding of various hypothetical flood insurance plans. In 2 weeks, on March 8th, Christian Messier will talk about how to increase the resilience of urban trees. Today, we take a break from severe storms and extreme heat and talk about earthquakes. Today, Doctors Juan Fung and Yating Zhang of the National Institute of Standards and Technology will tell us about earthquakes. They're going to speak about policy lessons Canada can take from Japan and other earthquake-prone countries, especially in light of the New Year's Day 2024 earthquake in Noto, Japan. I'm particularly interested in this talk because I want to know if Japan is really all that far out ahead of us, and if so, in what ways. Doctors Fung and Zhang are well qualified to talk about this subject. For those unfamiliar with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it does physical science for the U.S. Commerce Department. Its mission is to promote American industrial competitiveness, to enhance economic security, and improve Americans' quality of life. Dr. Fung is a NIST economist who studies disaster resilience, including, among other things, models of seismic retrofit costs and benefits. Dr. Zhang is a civil engineer who focuses on climate change adaptation and earthquake resilience. Before our speakers begin, here's our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speakers will present for about half that time, then I'll moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please chat your questions into the Q&A box. I will try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speakers' slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. Find this and all of our webinars at www.iclr.org/workshops. Juan and Yating, thank you for speaking with us today. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for the invitation. Excited to talk about this topic because, like Keith, we are also curious about what Japan is doing differently than the United States and what lessons we might learn for the United States. And then it turned into, we did a comparative analysis of several earthquake-prone countries and trying to see what lessons we could learn from all the different ranges of policies. So it was a really good learning experience, and I hope that this can also be helpful for reducing earthquake risk in Canada. All right, so I'm going to advance my slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so this talk is based on a paper that actually Yating led. She was the lead author. We published it in 2020 in the Journal of Earthquake Engineering. And we focused on 10 of the most earthquake-prone countries around the world. And one of the goals was to learn what these countries are doing to address earthquake resilience and earthquake risk reduction, but then also to identify best practices that might be useful for governments. So I'm not going to cover all 10 of the countries that we reviewed. It's a lot. I encourage you to look at the paper if you have a chance. In this presentation, I'll focus on the United States, New Zealand, and Japan, and I'll explain why. But it gives you a good sense of the spectrum of policy environments. For example, in the United States, you know, everything is very decentralized and local, versus in Japan, there's a lot more top-down guidance in terms of standards as well as retrofit, policies. So it's that I think is one of the most important things to understand is understanding the policy environment for your government. Okay. So the study scope, we focused on identifying criteria and requirements for retrofit. The strategies used for promoting retrofit, for example, incentives or any kind of communication strategies, policy effectiveness in the context of the local policy context, and implementation challenges. And we decided to focus on these 10 countries, the United States, New Zealand, and Japan, obviously, but then also China, Nepal, India, Iran, Turkey, Romania, and Italy. Italy is an interesting case too because they have a lot of earthquake risk and they've done a lot. But again, the policy environment is very different in Italy. So in this talk, as I said, we're going to focus on Japan, New Zealand, and the United States, and largely because you may or may not know that the Japan, New Zealand, and the west coast of the United States kind of span what's called the Circum-Pacific seismic belt. And that accounts for about 90% of all seismic activity in the world, which is pretty tremendous. And 81% of the world's largest earthquakes have occurred in this area. And so being some of the highest earthquake risk nations, we thought, in showing you the spectrum of policies as well as, Japan being at the forefront, New Zealand as well, and then United States may be closer to the Canadian environment. I'm not sure, but hopefully this gives you a good sense of the range of policy options. So I am going to now hand it over to Yating, and she's going to give you a quick review of earthquake policy. And then I'll follow up with what lessons we learned, not just from these 3 countries, but from all the countries that we reviewed, and hopefully, lessons learned that could help inform policy in Canada.
Thank you. If you ask government for seismic
Yating, I think your audio is cutting out. I'm sorry.
I can't hear.
Yating, can you hear me?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I think it might be your headphones are cutting out. They're going in and out.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hi, Yating. This is the event producer speaking. Could you perhaps try disabling your video camera just to improve your internet stability and then try speaking?
And just say me.
Yes, well, unfortunately, we're still having audio issues from your line. And can you try turning off your video and then speaking? See if that helps.
Can you hear me now? I have removed the AirPods.
That's a
Hello.
little bit better.
Okay. I will try to speak loudly. In the US, state and local governments are responsible for developing seismic risk mitigation policies. There is no federal mandate for building codes and standards to be adopted across all jurisdictions. Therefore, a large variation can be observed in retrofit policies. In general, retrofit ordinance target on buildings of certain structural types and construct before certain years. For example, the unreinforced masonry buildings construct before 1934, the wood frame buildings with soft stories construct before 1978, and non-ductile concrete buildings construct before 1976, and steel movement frame buildings construct before the 1994 Northridge earthquake are required to be strengthened by many California cities. In addition, after the Northridge earthquake, as shown in the picture, the state of California requires that all hospitals to be upgraded to meet the immediate occupancy performance requirements. To encourage buildings owners to retrofit their buildings, the Earthquake Brace and Void program at California provides grants to homeowners in regions with high seismic risk, and the PACE program, which is a national program, provides a low-interest loan for the bundled seismic and energy upgrades. The California Earthquake Authority also provides insurance premium discount for homes that are retrofit to meet the minimum code requirements. Moreover, cities in California have implemented a set of measures to promote seismic retrofits, including but not limited to waiving the plan review and permission and building permit fees and construction tax, and providing retrofit grants for design and construction, or allowing the building owners to pass a portion of the retrofit costs to tenants over 10 or 20 years. Next slide. In New Zealand, seismic design standards and retrofit policies are adopted at the local jurisdiction level. However, the national government can mandate code adoption by the local authority. The first national building code of New Zealand is a performance-based code modeled on Norway's code. The national code specified functional requirements and performance criteria for buildings rather than prescribing how a building is to be built. The Building Act 2004 provides the first retrofit standards for existing buildings. It sets the minimum level of seismic retrofit to be 34% of the code requirements for new buildings. However, the New Zealand Society of Earthquake Engineering argued that the minimum level of seismic retrofit should be higher, up to 67% of code requirements for new construction. So by 2017, about 27% of local authorities adopt a retrofit level of 67%, while the rest of authorities adopt a retrofit level between 34 and 67%. The variation in retrofit policies is also reflected in the triggers for retrofit actions. Some local authorities in New Zealand use an active approach. That means a timeline is offered to identify and assess potential hazardous buildings and retrofit and demolish those buildings. However, some authorities use a passive approach. The retrofit is only required when altering or changing the use of an existing building. After the 2011 earthquake, as shown in the picture, New Zealand amended the building code. The 2016 Act tightened the retrofit requirements and shortened the time frame for identifying the potential hazardous buildings. The Act also specifies the earthquake-prone buildings and defines the risk categories and corresponding deadlines for engineering assessment and seismic upgrade. To promote seismic retrofits, New Zealand has established incentive programs for heritage buildings nationwide and offered certain levels of incentives for the non-heritage buildings in the big cities. Next slide. In Japan, the national building standards are defined under the Building Standard Law, implemented by both the national and local governments. The 1995 earthquake led to the adoption of the first retrofit standards in Japan, named the 1994 Seismic Retrofitting Promotion Law. The law provides measures and guidelines for identifying and strengthening seismically deficient existing buildings, especially for the buildings constructed before 1981. The law was amended in 2005 due to the 2004 earthquake. The update law includes the retrofitting promotion plans of local governments. The law was further amended in 2013 due to the earthquake in 2011, as shown in the picture, which caused tremendous losses in Japan. The update law mandates the seismic diagnosis for the large-scale buildings such as hospitals and schools, and requiring that the diagnosed results be published. In this process, Japan raised the proportion of earthquake-resistant building from 75% in 2003 to 95% in 2020. To ensure that the retrofitting meets the requirements of the promotion law, Japan actively collects data and to formulate the retrofit policies and to close the gap between the actual and the planned retrofit rates. Both the national and local governments have provided financial incentives for seismic diagnosis and retrofit. In addition to promoting the compliance with the building standard law, Japan provides financial incentives to buildings that meet the criteria about the mandatory standard. Next slide. Okay. Juan will discuss.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Yating. And as I said, there's a lot more detail in the paper, and you can take a look for some of the other countries. But in light of the Noto earthquake on January 1st, we wanted to reflect on whether the national building standard in Japan and all these amendments, right, are they working? The general sentiment by professionals is that they are working. Now you're probably wondering, why was there so much damage from the Noto earthquake? The Noto earthquake was part of a swarm of earthquakes that began in late 2020. And there's been a cumulative damage on buildings. In fact, some of the damage was identified last year, but had been uncorrected at the time of the earthquake, or unrepaired. So this is something that in the literature they call invisible risk. You know, it wasn't so invisible actually because it was identified. But you imagine, aside from the buildings that were evaluated after the previous large earthquake in 2022, there's probably a lot of small damage that hasn't been identified. Okay, so that's one issue, and swarms are very different because it's essentially it's a large number of earthquakes that happen over an extended period of time that aren't necessarily, as I understand it, I'm not a geologist or I'm an economist. I should have said that at the beginning, but from what I read, you know, they're not clearly due to tectonic shifts, and so they're somewhat unpredictable. And so there's still a little bit of work that needs to go into understanding how swarms and cumulative damage can affect buildings. The second interesting thing about this earthquake, it hit 3 prefectures in Japan really hard: Ishikawa, Toyama, and Niigata. And then there was extensive damage, as you've seen. And I apologize. I think the numbers I have here are just for Ishikawa in terms of the damaged homes, but that was where most of the damage was sustained, was in Ishikawa Prefecture. And a large amount of deaths and injuries. Insured loss is estimated at 6 billion. This is based on insurance industry estimates. There were secondary hazards such as fire and tsunami. It wasn't as bad as people thought because there was no tectonic movement to cause major tsunamis like in 2011. But Ishikawa Prefecture in particular has an aging population that has deferred retrofit work. And in Ishikawa Prefecture, the compliance rate for retrofit work is about, hold on, I have it written down somewhere. It's about 51%. That's compared to the national average of 89%. So that's a big gap. In terms of whether the laws are working, when people, when people do comply, it seems like they are, but they don't address these issues where an aging population is deferring costly and disruptive retrofit work. In addition, at the time of the Noto earthquake, Ishikawa Prefecture was working on updating its retrofit plan from 1997, and it's working on an update for 2025. And I'm guessing the Noto earthquake is probably going to inform that a little bit more now. But the overall sentiment is that the retrofit policy has worked. And it just highlights that there are these social components that aren't necessarily these social challenges that aren't necessarily accounted for in the law. But it highlights, I think it's one of the lessons overall, that the process is always evolving. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to lessons learned. And what we did was we took stock of, we compared all these policies across 10 nations. And what we wanted to do was identify, best practices. We kind of framed them in this idealized retrofit process. And it's not the retrofit of a single building. You would think it's the implementation of a retrofit policy in a community, right? First, you identify the problem. That's risk assessment. Knowledge transfer is really important because there's often a gap between the people on the ground that have to implement this and then the experts who develop the guidance. Setting priorities. How do you decide which buildings to retrofit? As you've seen, largely the policies are based on structural system. Implementation, once you have the policy deployed, how do you ensure compliance? And even under mandatory policies, as in Japan, and then there are a few in the United States as well. We have a different paper where we looked at this. Even under mandatory retrofit policy, compliance isn't always 100%. And finally, monitoring. You have to kind of keep an eye on things and keep checking and making sure the actual outcomes align with your expected outcomes. And it's an iterative process, right? Because this monitoring is what allows you to course correct. And Japan has been very good about that. They're constantly monitoring and updating things. Okay, so the first one, risk assessment. As I said, this is identifying the problem. And there are several best practices that we identified. I think the lowest cost way to support seismic risk reduction is to support evaluation. Supporting evaluation is less costly, financially for a community than supporting the retrofit work itself. And it gets the process started and it identifies the risk. And brings me to the second point, which is it's really important to make sure results are public so that there's open information on the risk. Third is communication. communication about risk of your building stock and the expected performance, there's often a misalignment in what people expect a building to, how people expect a building to perform in an earthquake versus the actual performance. But, you know, a lot of times this stuff is communicated with, you know, very technical terms, and it should be simple, right? It should be simple to understand. And finally, the invisible risk that we talked about. Shaking from previous events can result in unseen damage and often goes unaddressed. So I think more research needs to go into that. All right, the second stage called knowledge transfer. You know, this is going from experts to practice, right? One of the biggest things that, especially nations that have the ability to set national standards, they can also provide standardized decision support tools. That's not always feasible. For example, in the United States, that's not feasible because everything is so local. Nevertheless, you know, in the United States, there is a lot of work to standardize these processes and make it easier for people to make economically informed decisions. Excuse me. The second one is public-private partnerships. This is a pretty typical in the development of codes and standards, where you have experts and partnering with professionals to develop the codes and standards, but it can go a lot further in developing evaluation methods, in developing financing strategies, in helping to educate the public. I mean, the goal here is to expand the knowledge base and educate the public and increase technical training. Then the third best practice is to leverage local knowledge. The local community knows its challenges and risks better than anyone else. You know, leverage the local community, learn from the community, and often local insights can be helpful for other communities. For example, in Fremont, California, Fremont developed soft story standards that were later adopted across other jurisdictions and then included in the 2003 International Existing Building Code. Now, this had me thinking when, you know, we put the paper together, we didn't talk about this, but ultimately, there is no cohesive mechanism for sharing knowledge, you know, for example, from experts to communities, or from communities, you know, one community to another, right? That's part of the reason we conducted this research, is because there was no way to really get a sense of what was out there without wading through everything ourselves. But just we had the idea that maybe a community of practice could be a good idea. I'm not sure if that's something that would work in Canada, but you know, I think any, you know, local community can set one up, and you know, with the purpose of learning from other communities potentially. Okay, setting priorities. As I said, largely buildings identified for retrofit have been, you know, it started with the most vulnerable buildings being unreinforced masonry. In some countries, it's adobe, you know, things that are obviously very high risk. And then from there on, and from each earthquake event, the laws are updated to account for other structural systems. But there's an argument to be made that you can prioritize buildings based on their role in the community rather than the system itself. And one example of that is, as Keith said, California Senate Bill 1953, which focused on hospitals and making sure hospitals were able to provide, you know, something like an immediate occupancy performance. But also, public buildings. Often, when local government, owns and is in charge of these buildings, and they can set a precedent, and they have ownership of the building, so that can often get things started in the community. Implementations. This is about ensuring compliance, and this is really tricky. And I would say, this is something that requires a lot of thought. Financial support matters, but so does the type of support. So, for example, grants and subsidies work better than loans, for example, low interest loans. So you have to take that into account depending on what your goals are. There's all sorts of incentives like grants, subsidies, tax reimbursements, government loans. Also, as Yating mentioned, pairing seismic retrofit with energy upgrades. And this is not an exhaustive list. So there's a lot of creative ways to get folks more interested in seismic retrofit. Another thing that can really help is having a standardized process. It saves time and it saves money. And often, especially in the United States, every community has their own process because it's all local, right? Whereas in countries like Japan, the processes are very standardized because they're set, based on the national building standard. Triggers are really important, as Yating mentioned too. For example, if you wanted to conduct a renovation, it's an opportunity to trigger a seismic evaluation, and you can just streamline that process without having to reinvent the wheel. And finally, integration with other objectives. So sustainability and climate adaptation are two of the ones we mentioned, but there are others, right? Because as a building owner doesn't just care about one thing. So in terms of incentivizing building owners to take action, thinking about ways to pair it with the kinds of renovations that they're interested in, that seems to be really successful. And finally, monitoring. As I said, keeping an eye on expected versus actual outcomes. This is an iterative process, not one time. As I said, Japan does this regularly. They collect data and course correct as needed. And to the extent possible, this is something that more communities should be doing. Excuse me. Holistic, by which I mean take a holistic perspective and consider the building's role in the community and in the economy, and keep an eye on recovery. Retrofit is one piece of the puzzle, and it's a very important piece, but you also have to build in safety nets, such as mandatory earthquake insurance, because, as in the case of the Ishikawa prefecture, you have a lot of folks who didn't actually conduct the retrofit work. And then there's an event that causes a lot of severe damage. So how do you ensure recovery, because this process, you're talking about many years of developing, an evaluation and a diagnosis approach, deploying that, setting timelines and criteria. That's many years. It's going to be, at least a decade or so before you actually start seeing retrofits conducted. So, even in the interim, you need to think about how you're going to ensure recovery when you know that there are high-risk buildings in your community. All right, so key takeaways. By and large, retrofit policy is reactive. Historically, it's been driven by catastrophic earthquakes, and that was one of the biggest lessons learned. Most often, the approach is voluntary with some financial and technical assistance. But Japan and New Zealand, they're not exactly on the proactive end, but they're moving more towards that proactive end because of the highly catastrophic earthquakes that they've experienced in the recent, in the 21st century. And that has led them to be more forward thinking. I thought that was a lot in terms of the best practices. So we wanted to kind of distill, what are the big pieces here? Continuous improvement, setting timelines, monitoring and course correcting, and then an open process and communication. Support, especially providing tools for easy diagnosis, and financial support for diagnosis and retrofit. And then using nudges. So the triggers, for example, or public buildings that can set a precedent in the community. Key challenges is prioritizing for retrofit beyond the most highly vulnerable systems or critical buildings. It's not clear cut, and it's going to be very community context dependent. One of the biggest challenges is that there are misaligned or insufficient incentives, between a community's risk and an individual building owner. The retrofit work is very disruptive, it's expensive, and to the building owner, there's no immediate return. So that's where thinking more carefully about how to incentivize comes in. And finally, as we said, making sure risk perception about earthquake risk in general and about a building specifically, building performance specifically, thinking about ways to communicate risk more clearly. Oh, and that's the last slide.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We have no open questions from the audience, but I have a lot of questions. So we'll start with mine, and maybe they'll inspire questions from our attendees. Starting with the New Zealand standard, you talked about retrofit strengths of 34% of new design, and a small number of communities retrofitting, having a standard that retrofits to 67%. Can you tell us how do they justify what's their rationale for saying 34% or 67%?
I think, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you.
I think the 34% is based on the retrofit costs and economic consideration.
Sorry, it's based on the retrofit cost, did you say?
So my internet is not stable.
Okay. So you said that the 34% is based on the retrofit cost. You mean that because retrofit is so expensive, they keep the standard low to make it affordable?
Yes, exactly. And the 37% is based on my.
Sorry, you're breaking up again. Okay, now we're hearing you a little better. Juan, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, just wanted to add, it's I think the 34% represented the minimum, often as it goes in standards, it was the minimum based on potential performance relative to a new building.
Yeah. I just wonder how it's explicitly justified. Because lawyers are going to want to know, why is 34% enough? And property owners, in institutional property owners might want to know, well, is 34% enough? Is that what I should go for?
So in fact, even in the California, they use 17% as the that I showed. So I think so. Sorry.
Sorry, we're not hearing you. Let me we did get a question from an anonymous attendee. Have you seen examples of monetizing investments in earthquake protection? I work in climate resilient infrastructure, and one challenge we're dealing with is encouraging private investment where returns might be significant but hard to measure in the near term. Monetizing investments in earthquake protection. Not sure what that means. Do you understand?
I was hoping maybe a little more clarity on monetizing investments in earthquake protection. Is that
Yeah, anonymous attendee, would you mind explaining a little bit more what you mean by monetizing investments? In the meanwhile, while our attendee is dealing with that, I want to ask you about. I want to probe your points about making risk assessment information public. Now, I'm a structural engineer, not an economist, and it seems to me that economists commonly hold that risk information can become a market force. But I wonder if that isn't as much sort of belief or dogma as empirical fact. Can you offer empirical evidence to show that the kinds of information that you're advocating sharing actually becomes a market force and makes a difference?
That's a good question, Keith. Give me one sec.
Sure. Thank you for working through the, despite your cold.
Yeah, it's a little hard to talk. I'm sorry. I think, in terms of the dogma from economics, there's a lot of market failure that can result from in asymmetry in information or incomplete information, and the more information is shared, the hope is that those market failures can be reduced. Now, in the context of retrofit in particular, and communicating, seismic diagnosis results, it's really just about accountability. And there's two facets. It's communicating to the public from the community's perspective that you're taking action, and two, that there are these buildings out there that have been identified and what has happened since then, right? And there's a lot of cities in California that that have adopted this approach, and it's not just for those building owners, it's for their neighbors.
Well, I understand why it seems like a good idea. I'm just wondering if anybody has tested the hypothesis that making this information public brings about retrofit, or I even wonder if making the information public does lead to any kind of accountability. I mean, if you built a building and you built it to code at the time you built it, I just wonder if there is any liability, if anybody's ever actually been sued for buildings that collapse or hurt people in earthquakes after making this risk information public. I mean, I understand something about the legal principles. You knew or you should have known, but the defense is still, hey, it met code. I had an occupancy permit, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. If there has been litigation, yeah, that it is a really good question. So no, I did allude to another paper that Yating and I wrote, where we looked at several of these. It was on wood frame soft story ordinances in California. We looked at a few communities and compared, the 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 policy parameters as well as the community socioeconomic characteristics in explaining the observed retrofit compliance rate. I don't think we explicitly took into account whether the information was public because, since we're using public information, so that there's already that selection bias. But it's a good question, actually.
Okay. Let's see. You talked about public risk assessment. You didn't. I don't think you mentioned particular protocols. I mean, in the United States, there's three tiers of ASCE 41, and there's there are other standards, FEMA P154, and one or two others. I don't think you mentioned the ones for New Zealand or Japan, and just those U.S. ones have this big range of cost and putative precision. How would you balance cost and the credibility of these assessments? And if somebody, the head of NIST, called you up and said, what protocol should we be using, what would you tell them?
Yeah, so I think this is the case for the San Francisco. After the Northridge earthquake, they did a lot of studies um, on the wood frame self-story buildings because the previous requirements is to bring the buildings up to the current building code requirements, but that costs a lot of retrofit cost and a very low voluntary retrofit rates. That's why they did some economic analysis, including engineering analysis. So they eventually find out, create new standards to ensure that the retrofit to some level that doesn't cause a lot of retrofit costs and can ensure the basic requirements for the safety.
Well, actually, that's a really interesting case study. I think you're referring to the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety from around 2008, and that was a standard that was actually set by a community group. The city convened an advisory group of I think it was dozens of building owners, tenants, and other interests. And these groups met. This group met over and over, and I think they had something like 80 meetings over the course of a research project. And the engineers who did this economic analysis, I was among them. We presented several options to them. And we said, here's the cheapy one, and here's a middle of the road one, and here's an expensive one. We did, it was almost as simple as that. And the committee said, well, we like the expensive one. Let's just fix the problem. And they recommended that fix to the city council or the board of supervisors, and the board of soups passed it. But there was, when it came down to a balance between cost and efficacy, that community said, nuts to the cost. We want efficacy. We want the job done, the problem solved. So I wonder, are we focusing too much on saving the owner's cost if at least that community wants a solution to the problem, wants the problem solved rather than just sort of solved? I mean, that raises the question of whether this 34% or the 67% are adequate, or if that's just policymakers afraid of angering building owners. Sorry,
Yes,
I went on a long time. What do you think?
Sorry, go ahead, Yating.
yeah. So I agree from the engineering perspective, we want to improve the buildings to the best performance that we can provide. But in terms of building owners, they need to pay for the retrofit. So they will consider more about the outcomes and their investment. So so I think in most of the studies we have reviewed, the economic cost is a top concern for the most of the building owners. And that's why we think that the financial incentives from the governments, from the nonprofit organizations are important to help improve the building performance at the acceptable cost of the building owners.
Juan, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you, Yating. I agree. We do, I think, but ultimately, because as Yating said, somebody has to pay for it, and you know, even with a mandatory law, you can't force people to do something they don't want to do. Not just they have to pay for it, but it's disruptive, and so it's a tricky balance for sure. But there is always that trade-off.
And actually, that sort of brings us to a question of stakeholder interest alignment. I'm sort of interested in the costs and benefits of these mandatory programs and how the costs and the benefits accrue to different groups, right? Oftentimes it looks like the owner's going to have to pay for it, and you know, other people enjoy benefits. The future owners get a benefit. The tenants get a benefit if the tenants are not the owners. The city, the state, the federal government, in the case of the United States, all get benefits. Insurers and all these other stakeholder groups enjoy benefits they don't necessarily have to pay for. So do the examples in New Zealand and Japan, do they give us do they provide any guidance on how better to align the costs and the benefits so that these co-beneficiaries sort of pay their fair share of the cost of retrofit?
It's tricky, right? Because in Japan, for example, the national government has a little bit more control. It's a little bit more paternalistic, maybe. I'm not sure what the right term is, but you know, it is in the government's interest. You know, they are some of the beneficiaries, so it is in their interest to provide these incentives, and they do provide financial incentives. Versus in the United States, there are no national incentive programs because everything is local. So I'm not sure what it's like in Canada. I'm guessing it's closer to the United States, probably. In which case, you know, thinking about those incentives is really important. And you know, one of the things, obviously, the owner, given the opportunity, is going to pass that cost on to the tenant, you know, if they're forced to do something, right? So some cities in California, they put a cap on how much cost you can pass on, because then, you know, that's an undue burden on the tenant, even if the tenant is enjoying some of the benefit, more of the benefit relative to the owner. It might not be equitable to pass on that entire cost to them. So yeah, it's not clear cut.
Okay. Your colleague and my old classmate, CMX Sitar, says this is a comment in response to Keith's question regarding the balance between cost and precision. I think the primary focus should be on identifying killer buildings. The simple linear evaluation procedure is shown to be sufficient to identify those buildings. CMAC, by linear evaluation procedure, I guess you're referring to something out of ASCE 4117 or something, some sort of tier 2 kind of analysis with linear structural analysis. I assume that's what you mean. Yes, he says yes. Okay. Juan, Yating, do you have any thoughts about CMAC's comment?
No, I defer to Dr. Satar.
Yating?
But I felt bad about the other question that was popped up on monetizing investments, and I apologize that I mean, I'm going to attempt to answer it. If you mean, for example, securitizing it somehow through bonds, maybe is that the idea? So you have private investors who buy into these bonds that fund upgrades. I don't know that I've seen that specifically in earthquake risk reduction, but it exists. That definitely exists. It tends to be more at a community project level, but I could be wrong. I haven't looked into literature in a few years.
We'll let the anonymous attendee stew on that. Let's see. Oh, here we get some more questions. Andre Mendez says, did you compare earthquake insurance take-up rates between the countries that you studied? If so, can you comment? For example, a high take-up rate was successful because, or a low take-up rate is, because of blah blah blah. Did you look at that question, earthquake insurance take-up?
We did, and I do apologize. My memory is a little foggy, but it did vary quite a bit across the different countries. And Yating, if you have a little bit more clarity, maybe you can jump in. So I don't want to. I hope I'm not misremembering, but I felt that there are countries like Italy where it was more prevalent, versus in countries like the United States, it's not. I think that's what I remember. Yating, do you recall?
Actually, I'm not familiar with the California insurance. They encourage the retrofit by the hazardous buildings, and if the buildings are retrofit to meet the requirements of the code, they can provide a certain of discount by the insurance premium. I think some other countries like Japan also have similar policies about insurance, about the discount of insurance premium. In Japan, the government is collaborating with a bank to provide the low interest loan and the low insurance premium for the building owners who strengthen their buildings to meet their criteria, and if they above the criteria, my discounts can be applied.
And you think that
Yeah,
has increased take-up rates, insurance take-up rates?
Yes.
And so what I will say, yeah, I thank you, Yating. If I recall correctly, they're still fairly low in the United States because it's voluntary in most places. And I just looked again. It's in Italy, earthquake insurance for residential buildings is compulsory. And the same is true in Turkey. So it's required. And often the insurance is sponsored or reinsured by the government. So it's a very different environment. In the United States, as I said, most places it's voluntary, it's not required. So if it's not required, the rates are typically low.
Yeah, I think in the California Earthquake Authority's market penetration is on the order of 12%. That's most of the single family dwellings in California. Despite the fact that even if there's a incentive for retrofit, and as there are incentives for retrofit, the California Earthquake Authority, we heard from their chief resilience officer last year before last, where they give out grants of $3,000 if you do the earthquake brace and bolts, and more if you have if you're low income. I think they'll pay for the entire retrofit. And yet, 12%. So those incentives, they don't seem to be hugely effective, at least in bringing take-up rates up. Let's see. You spoke about invisible risk, and you suggested that previous earthquakes eroded performance in Japan. Now, that's long been a hypothesis in the structural engineering community, and maybe research since the last time I paid any attention to this bears it out. When you talk about invisible risk, are you offering a reasonable hypothesis, or do you point to research that has shown this to be true, that past earthquakes erode the performance of buildings and make them more likely to collapse?
Yeah, no, it's a hypothesis, but it is something that it's a hypothesis that some countries take seriously. And in the case of Noto, the January 1st earthquake, it wasn't really invisible risk. There was actually identified damage, and it just wasn't corrected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Can you compare or contrast the incentives that Japan and New Zealand offer with California's earthquake brace and bolts grants? Are they, the earthquake brace and bolts grants in California affect on the, they fund on the order of, I don't know, a few thousands of retrofits a year. And there are hundreds of thousands, or I don't know, maybe millions of buildings that need it. So there's a lot of work, but it's kind of a drop in the bucket compared with the need. What's the story in Japan and New Zealand about providing support for retrofits?
I think in New Zealand they have the similar challenges. They are they have taken great effort to promote the retrofit, but due to the limited of financial support, most of buildings in small towns have not received financial support and are not retrofit. Only the big cities with high seismic risk hazard are likely to get the funding from the government. And in particular, New Zealand provide financial assistance to the heritage buildings, the historical buildings, more than the common residential or commercial buildings. And in Japan, I think they only focus on the house and the large scale buildings such as hospitals and schools. For the rest of buildings, they might not receive financial support from the government. So this is like a prioritizing the building types and the risk of the buildings to provide the financial support.
And didn't a lot of the collapses we saw in Nota in the New Year's Day 2024 earthquake. Weren't a lot of them in traditional Japanese house construction? And
Yeah,
that
residential, wood residential. Yeah.
heavy and weak and brittle kind of housing that
Correct.
collapses over and over again in Japan. But you say that they're not actually providing grants to retrofit those?
Yeah, for the house construct before 1981.
That they do or do
Yeah,
not?
they do.
Okay.
I mean, the national governments and the local governments, they will provide a portion of the subsidy to the building owners for diagnose and retrofit. And this has a time limit. Like it only provides financial incentives for those complete the retrofit work within like 2 years or 3 years. If you don't complete the retrofit on time, you might not receive the same amount of incentives.
Are these grants rationed? I mean, if every owner of every one of these buildings decided tomorrow, yeah, I'm going to go, retrofit my pre-1981 house, has the government committed to fund them all? And what fraction is this portion?
So I think for each incentive program, they have a time limit. I mean, if some building owners don't want to retrofit within the time period, so yeah, so they might not be able to get the financial support. But I think this is just to aim to encourage the building owners to retrofit. It's not to make sure all the buildings can be retrofit in time. And I know in California they do give a longer time period for the building owners who have financial difficulties, so they don't need to comply on time as required by the ordinance.
How much of the cost does the government of Japan cover?
I think that is a huge amount.
So there were subsidies from the central government and from the local government, so it varied. And as Yating said, it varied depending on the timing, but it could be it was 33% of the diagnosis was covered by the central government if there was no support from the local government. And then I think it would be up to 66% with local government support.
But just of the diagnosis of the assessment of risk
For the
as opposed
diagnosis.
to actually
For
fixing.
the retrofit, yeah, I think it was up to 23%.
So most of the cost is still on the owner. 77% is still on the owner.
Yeah, no, so they did offer these limited time promotions to incentivize the work more quickly, and that went up to 100% for diagnosis and up to 66% for retrofit.
Oh, and did they have a big take up when they were offering 66% for the retrofit costs?
That's a good question. Do you remember if there was?
I don't remember the exact number. Sorry.
Ballpark, was it a small fraction, a big fraction of the buildings that were eligible? Because that's a big question.
That actually took up the retrofit. No, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
Okay. Andre Mendez commented. He says, I believe that in the New Zealand slide, You mentioned performance-based codes. Is this the same as life safety or something superior in the sense of requiring resiliency and minimal disruption in the aftermath of an earthquake? So just to clarify for everybody else, there are performance-based codes in the United States that say we're going to retrofit this building so that it remains, so that there's a low probability that the building is a collapse in such and such an earthquake. That's called collapse prevention. A little bit stronger, and we say it's life safe, low probability that anybody's going to be killed in an earthquake of such and such a size. And then there's higher standards. There's immediate occupancy is one of the higher standards. Basically we provide strength and stiffness and stability to meet that performance level, life safety, or collapse prevention, life safety, immediate occupancy, etc. So his question is that in New Zealand, is this performance-based code calling for life safety, or is it something else?
I think the performance-based code is similar to the ASCE 41. It has the definitions for different level of performance. I haven't taken a close look at the codes itself, but I know they do provide different levels of performance and let the building owners to decide which level they prefer.
Which always seems, I mean, I have been an engineering risk consultant for quite a while, and that always seems to stymie my clients, right? Where the engineer comes to them and says, "Oh, here's a menu of choices. You can retrofit to this level, that level, the other level, and you can retrofit to these levels for various combinations of shaking intensity, and it's all up to you." And the owners have pushed back and said, "I don't know, what does everybody else do?" That's a big problem. The engineering community sort of leaves a lot of freedom in the hands of the owners and doesn't provide a whole lot of guidance. And there's not a whole lot of guidance coming from government. You see in the well, anyway, do you have comments about is New Zealand or is Japan specifying? I guess Yating, you just said New Zealand is leaving the performance objective up to the owner. What about Japan? Is it when they're paying for retrofit, are they paying for a particular performance level, or what's being paid for?
So in Japan, because they have a national building code, so it is quite standard among different. I mean, they just build all the buildings to the same level of requirements. So they are not that flexible. I mean, the building owners cannot decide what level of performance they can have. So I think the life safety is still the minimum requirements for the Japan, and they do provide some higher level criteria in order to provide better performance for the buildings, and that is up to the building owners. The building owners who want to get their buildings more resilient and to invest on that. So I think in Japan it is not very flexible because every building is constructed to meet the requirement for the National Building Code.
So the retrofit brings these older buildings up to current code.
Yes.
That's interesting.
So Keith, what is the environment like in Canada? I am curious.
Well, it's less it seems that there's less support for seismic retrofit. There are government programs, but it's not. I don't think the programs are as big as like FEMA's BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. The FEMA BRIC program pays for 75% or more of the cost to bring public buildings, to remediate public buildings. So you can, those federal money in the United States that paid for fixing a bunch of schools in LA after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. And I don't believe that in Canada, the earthquake resilience programs are anywhere near that mature or have that high an uptake rate. But that just could be because we just don't have that many earthquakes. It's been a long time since the last. It's been 300 years since the last Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, long before Vancouver was there. Anyway, that's a long way of me trying not to say I don't really know, and I don't think it's as mature as in the United States.
Got it.
What do
Thank
you
you.
think? What do you think is the big gaps? I mean, you said this is an area that needs research. That's an area that needs research. But if you were going to sort of talk about solving America's earthquake risk problem for existing buildings, what do you think the big gaps are in terms of standards or funding or regulation? What needs to happen for America just to solve its earthquake problems?
That's a loaded question.
Big one. It's a big, hard one.
So I think there's a couple of things. One of the biggest problems, I think, and it's not just America, I think it's risk perception, right?
Mhm.
And I'll take myself as an example, as an economist. I don't have any engineering training, but I've learned a little bit more about building performance in the last few years, and I would say that it was a big surprise because I think most people think that their buildings will perform better than they actually are designed to in an earthquake. That's the biggest gap. And how do you address that gap? It's not just communication, right? And you can't just put the information out there. People don't understand, people don't care. It's not salient. So there have to be more creative ways of getting that information, to click with people. My colleague Joe Johnson is exploring the use of images or augmented reality, for example, to so people can actually feel, get a sense, like a full sensory experience of building performance in an earthquake. And that might be one route. But that's not clear because humans, we have our cognitive biases, and it's going to be hard to convince people, first of all, that this is important, and second of all, that what they think is wrong. That part is really tricky. Then the second one is the financing. And yeah, as you mentioned earlier, it's not as straightforward as providing, for example, discounts on insurance when people don't really want to take up insurance to begin with, or providing grants. There have to be more creative solutions. I think some of the more promising solutions are really looking at pairing seismic retrofit with other renovations or other upgrades, like the PACE program in California. California, Utah, and I forget there was a third state that they expanded PACE to include seismic retrofit. PACE was their grants for energy upgrades. So finding these opportunities where there are, the risk of using more jargon, co-benefits, right? So there's benefits from multiple different uh, uh, different channels that people care about, right?
Yeah. You know, let's talk about financing. I'm an American, and I was living in the United States when Gulf War II came around. Gulf War II under George W. Bush came right on the heels or at the same time as a huge tax cut. So the United States has a hard time paying for some things, but doesn't even think about where the money's going to come from when it pays for, decides to go to war, for instance. So we pay for the stuff we want. Why don't we want to fix the earthquake problem? Why is going to war in the Middle East just a never worry about the cost, but preventing earthquake catastrophes in inevitable, predictable, well understood earthquake catastrophes on the West Coast? That's suddenly, we wonder where the money's going to come from.
Yeah, I won't comment on the spending on war, but I think it goes back to the first gap, which is that risk, the misalignment with risk perception. And ultimately, the United States has benefited from not having a hugely catastrophic earthquake in quite some time, since 1994's Northridge. That kind of leads people into a false sense of security with respect to earthquakes relative to other hazards. Unfortunately, the reality is that humans respond to things that are salient, and it might just be that again, policy continues to be reactive. It's not to say policy isn't there is a lot of proactive policy in the United States, but there is a limit because the urgency isn't there.
Well, and that sort of gets to public perception about earthquake risk versus government's perception about earthquake risk. I mean, in a lot of ways, the public is the public because they have no power to understand the issues, to make investments, etc. That's why we have ethics codes among structural engineers, because we treat the public as a group of people who can't protect themselves, so we have to protect them, right? When it comes to the earthquake resistance of buildings, for the most part, the public lacks the ability to understand or pay for remediating the risk that the building stock imposes on them. So, is our risk perception problem among the public, or is the risk perception problem in government, that it's effectively not, that government doesn't seem aware of how big the problem is? And if it's government, how do we change that?
Yeah, so another another tricky question. So in particular, in the United States, the government isn't a monolith. So I think across the federal government, there's a really good understanding of the risk. And so there's this huge gap in trying to communicate that risk down to the local level. I don't know that it's necessarily um, I don't know that it's necessarily just on the public. I think by the nature of the public, it's not something people think about in their day-to-day lives, and it's you can't really expect them to think about it either. And so I think it is on the governments, local governments as well, to take a more proactive role in trying to communicate that. Because I think the gap is there, right? If people were demanding, if the public was demanding more be done about earthquake risk. You'd probably have a lot more Congress people or council people or representatives taking action, right? But there's no political risk to not taking action because there's no political appetite for it.
Is New Zealand or Japan doing any better when it comes to sort of experts explaining to elected officials about earthquake risk?
Mm, Actually, New Zealand have a similar problems like in the United States. They also have the difficulties in promoting seismic retrofit. I'm not quite sure about the government, but we can find that so New Zealand improves the retrofit standards and policies after each large earthquake. So I think we might not overestimate the risk. It is a risk there when earthquake happen, and to show them the vulnerability of the buildings and the community. Like in Japan, they also improve the retrofit standards, the retrofit rate targets after each big earthquake. So yeah, there are still many buildings collapsed and people died because of the earthquake. So I think the government might have a better perception of the risk than the public.
Mhm. Thanks. We got about 2.5 minutes left, and I want to give this last 2.5 minutes to you. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything that you really want us to take away from? That you want to emphasize from your talk?
No, just wanted to thank you, Keith, for the invitation, and really enjoyed. I see my colleague Catherine Joe Johnson, who's also a co-author on this paper, made a comment. Government is so diverse. The federal government operates so differently than government at the local level, but in all cases, engineering has not been done by government, but by the engineering community. To assume that the public, including government representatives, understand both natural hazards, risk, and the possible response from the built environment is overestimating their current capacity and what we've asked them to understand in the past. And on that note, thank you, Joe.
We being the technocrats, we being the
Exactly.
people who spend all their time thinking about earthquake risk.
Yeah, I think ultimately, coming back to one of the recommendations here was knowledge transfer, right? Potentially there's an opportunity to build a community of practice because there is this gap, right, between us, the technocrats, as you said, and then the public. And I appreciate Joe saying, and it includes members of the government.
Yating, any last thoughts that we should take away?
No, I think one has a good summary for the takeaways.
Okay. Well, thank you, Juan and Yating. This was a great talk. And thanks everybody for attending. You will find a video of this conversation up on the ICLR webpage by Monday. And remember that in 2 weeks, on March 8th, Christian Messier will talk about how to increase the resilience of urban trees. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Juan. Thanks, Yating.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.